Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at Tamiya's recently reboxed 1/48 scale Martlet / Wildcat. So let's see how I get on. So as per most aircraft kits, we're going to be starting off by focusing our attention in the cockpit. As you can see on screen, I initially put the one-piece seat to the back of the framing. Here's me assembling the two-piece sidewalls. This is the same for both sides of the sidewalls, and they're made out of two pieces, just allowing Tamiya to get a little bit more detail in there. The one piece of rudder pedals can be secured onto the back of the instrument panel. Not the tightest of fits here, so make sure that you're happy with the angle by looking on the other side. I can now grab those two previously assembled sidewalls and slot them onto either side of the control panel. I was conscious to try my best here to ensure that they were near enough to a 90-degree from the control panel. This is just because the ends of both of those sidewalls are going to be slotting into the previously assembled framework with the seat on. As well as the cockpit, at this stage I'm also instructed to start having a look at the wheel well. The wheel well of the Wildcat / Martlet is a rather complex thing, so I was intrigued to see how Tamiya take this on. They break up the many struts of the landing gear into very manageable pieces, and it has a great modular build-up, so you don't do the entirety of the landing gear in this stage. I was now very happy that I was at a stage where I could start to get some paint down onto the model, so all of the sub-assemblies received a generous coating of Mid-Surfacer 1500 Grey. This provided me with a great base to do a little bit of pre-shading. To do some pre-shading, I'm going to be using Mr. Color's C2 Black, which is just a gloss black. It has some great opacity and looks like black, which is really what you want out of a black color. The reason for me doing this pre-shading in black is to hopefully create some darker regions of the paint, indicating some fake shadows or contrast on the final paint layer. I went round the entirety of the cockpit in this pre-shading effect before then going on top with the final colour, which is going to be Ammo Mig's Zinc Chromate Interior Green, or A220. This was thinned down at about a 50-50 ratio and sprayed at about the mark of 20 psi. Slight side note, I'm very apologetic for the state of my airbrush. It is absolutely minging looking. Luckily I do clean it after this clip, so this is the last time you're going to see it in such a state. But what I am doing with the slightly mucky looking brush is I'm very slowly building up the paint layer until I reach a place where I'm happy that I can still see some of that underlying pre-shading, but you get the general idea and look of zinc chromate as a colour. Now, using a variety of Ammo Mig colours, I can start to busy up the cockpit. This means I'm going to start detail painting, picking out all the switches and gauges which are required. Now, to seal all of the paintwork and provide a nice base for any weathering to go on top, I'm going to be using a VMS's matte varnish. If you've been following the channel for the last couple of videos, you might have noticed that I'm starting to use a matte base for my weathering slightly more frequently. It's more of a work in progress technique at the moment, but what I'm finding is that the matte base starts to grip the pigment in the washes and also gives a slightly more smoother gradient between that underlying paint layer and the washes on top. A slight negative, which did unfortunately come back to bite me in the bottom last video, was the fact that it is almost too grippy in some circumstances, leading me to have slightly less control over how much of the wash I can remove via white spirit on odourless thinners. However, after leaving all of this to dry, I was very happy with the outcome of this particular effect. It looked very natural, had smooth gradients, and just looked like natural dirt accumulation. Everything then received another coating of VMS's matte varnish. Here you can see what I was talking about earlier, as the instrument panel along with the sidewall slot into the back of that seat assembly. So that is when angles are quite important, but luckily I seemingly had my trigonometry all sorted. The included pilot figure could then be painted up off camera, and he is then slotted into the cockpit as well. The forward gear bay is also painted up off camera, but it uses the exact same effects as I showed on screen with the main cockpit assembly. However, this time it just looks a little bit different because it's on a white base instead of a zinc chromate base. I was then instructed to put the two fuselage halves together. These had some good fitment, however, I was a little bit skeptical about putting the two fuselage halves together without putting the cockpit tub in there first. And it kind of showed why I was. The fitment of this cockpit tub into the two fuselage halves wasn't very Tamiya-esque. What I mean by this is the rear bulkhead just had a small hairline gap running around the outside of it, which really started to annoy me, and I did in fact come back and actually use some filler and went around the outside to close it. So if I was building this kit again, maybe I'd put the cockpit tub in before I put the two fuselage halves together. With that small negative out of the way, I can push on with this build. Here you can see on screen that I'm cementing the upper half of the wing to the lower half of the wing. I can then slot this sub-assembly to the rest of the main fuselage, and it has some great fitment here. Something that I particularly liked about this portion of the build is the fact that it is broken up in a way that a seam actually runs along an actual panel line, which every modeler loves this. It just means that you don't have to do as much sanding. The front canopy can then be cemented into place. It is masked off using the kit supplied masks, which have to be cut out by yourself. On the topic of canopies, I didn't have the best of luck with this kit. Firstly, the front canopy was short shot in the original boxing of this kit for me, and then secondly, the main canopy actually snapped in half when I was taking the masking tape off, so that led to me having to remask it, and I painted it silver for historical accuracy that maybe they replaced it in field. Anyway, with my problems aside, everything was masked off, and then I could prime everything in Mr. Surfacer 1500 Grey again. Any imperfections on the model could be then sorted out at this stage of the build before we could move on to the main part of painting. Initially, I'm going to start off by spraying down Middlestone, and that is going to be done using Mr. Hobby's C21. So what are the numbers for this one? I'm going to be spraying the paint down at about 60% thinner to 40% paint. As the weather here in the UK is getting hotter, seemingly my paint ratios are changing as well, and that is going to be sprayed down at about 15 psi. And also, as you can see, now out of a clean brush. So now that we know the numbers behind what I'm spraying, what am I doing with this paint? So at this stage, what you can see on screen, I'm just trying to get a base layer of that Middlestone colour. Now what I can do, as you can see, using that off-white colour from Mr. Hobby, I'm going to add it into that mixture to create a lightened version of the Middlestone, and I can create some variation in the paint. So I'm going to be focusing this lightened version at all of the rivet lines along the model, and also some of the recessed areas on the ailerons. This just gives a slightly more patchy, faded out look, which, as I'm going to be doing a desert scheme for this one, is where it really would be. Once that is finished, the paintwork looked very faded indeed, so to bring it back down to a slightly more balanced look, what I did is I'm going to post shade, but this time with a darkened version. The darkened version of this paint was darkened just using Mr. Colour C2, I believe, which is black, and that is directed along all of the panel lines. This creates some almost shading along the panel lines, and also just brings the model back down to that balanced Middlestone looking colour. I wasn't completely happy at this stage of the build. I thought that the general tone of the Middlestone wasn't right. I wasn't happy. I thought it looked too cold. I think the reason behind this coldness was the fact that I used black to tone down the paint. Black is a very harsh colour. There's no leeway in it. It is black, you know. There's no sign of life in that colour. So to bring some life and warmth back into that Middlestone colour, I'm going to be using Mr. Colour C22, which is Dark Earth. This dark earth colour really helped to bring that warmth back in, and it's just because it's that lightened colour, and it also gives almost this dusty vibe, which I quite liked on the Middlestone. That was the Middlestone portion of the camouflage all sorted, so I could then use Ammo Mig's masking putty to create the camouflage pattern that was required. I can then use Mr. Colour C22 again to provide me with that base colour of dark earth. I was conscious that I wanted to have some unity between the two paints in terms of their fading, their shading, and their general vibe, if you understand what I mean. So to do this, all I'm going to be doing is actually kind of copying what I did on the Middlestone, but then transferring it to the dark earth. So here you can see me doing what I did before. I used a lightened version of the dark earth using off-white to lighten it up, and that is going to be sprayed along the rivet lines and other areas. And then, as I said in the Middlestone, I'm now going to be using black to create a darkened version of the brown and do some shading along the panel lines. It's good to note that I'm also using Mr. Rapid Thinner here instead of self-leveling thinner. Rapid Thinner it kind of says what it does on the tin, doesn't it? It thins rapidly and it makes sure your paint dries even quicker on the surface. What it does is it helps to prevent any spidering and pooling up of paint on the model. The masking putty can then be removed from the model. Very satisfying this, isn't it? Yeah, great. As well as being satisfying, it even leaves a nice sharp border between the two colours, you know. What more can you ask for? With the upper surfaces of the Martlet all sorted out, I could turn my attention to the underside. For this particular scheme, as you can hopefully see on screen now, it required a grey underside. It's good to note that there are apparently, or known, 3 different variants of the Martlet 3 in the desert. You had one with the azure blue underside, the one with the grey underside, which I'm doing now, and there was also one with a black underside. All 3 are very, very striking, and I'm impressed that no one does a set of decals for them so far. Anyway, back onto my personal scheme, I had a small predicament in the fact I didn't have the exact grey colour which was needed, which is that non-specular light grey colour. I'm not too sure if a manufacturer does an exact representation of this colour. If they do, please do let me know. So what I ended up having to do was settle on a Japanese colour instead, but I think it looks the part. What do you think? It was painted up in a very similar fashion to the upper surfaces of this model, initially giving it the base grey colour, then fading it with the lightened version. This time I was using an off-white colour, and then I brought it back down with the darkened version of the paint, post-shading along all of the panel lines. And that wrapped up the painting, or the main painting, for this build. I could then start to bring a couple more of the aspects together which were left off for painting purposes. This includes on screen now the tail plane. This has a tight fit, so I'm not too sure if there was a bit too much paint build up on there from my end, or it is just a very tight fit, but with enough pressure and enough stamping on it, it managed to slot into place. Now onto a completely different sub-assembly altogether. Here I am putting together the framework for the landing gear legs. This follows on from what I said earlier in the fact it is broken down absolutely perfectly. You know, it's not too fiddly. It is somewhat fiddly, but not too fiddly. I'd be intrigued to see what Mini Art did with such a part, as I know they have an interesting way of breaking down certain components. Along with it being very well broken down, it is also very, very secure. With such a intricate landing gear, usually you make sacrifices in strength. However, the Tamiya plastic is great, it's very rigid, and also there aren't too many connections on load-bearing points. As well as the engine being beautifully detailed, it also has some polycaps incorporated into it, which I absolutely love. I love a good polycap. I think it is a great way to secure your propellers. To now seal in all of the paintwork and create a good base for all of the decals to go on top, I'm going to give the entirety of the model a coating of gloss varnish. So as previously mentioned, there are no decal sets available for the specific scheme that I really wanted to do. So of course, with almost all of my modelling problems, I approached Hannants. Hannants London is my local model shop located next to the RAF Hendon Museum, and they are the go-to place for modelling. Almost overflowing with the latest kit, products and loads of built up models, it is bound to be any model maker's heaven. I know it is my own. As well as this, it is staffed by some of the most experienced modelers who are definitely able to help you with your modelling needs or problems. For example, I approached them with this scheme that I wanted to do, and right there and then they managed to find me the corresponding roundel, codes and so on. Their details are on screen now, so be sure to check them out. Moving back to the model, as you saw on screen, the decals went down very well indeed. The only issue that I did have was I might have gone a little bit over the top with the varnish, leading me to fill in a couple of those rivet details on the wings, meaning that the decals couldn't really sink into those details anymore. That's an issue on my end, nothing to do with the decals, so I'm just going to have to learn for next time. The decals were then sealed in, but this time using a matte varnish, as I said earlier, I'm quite enjoying using this matte varnish, before I could then go on top and do some weathering. As you saw, I'm going to be using the Mr. Weathering colour version of panel washes or washes in general, and what I did is I thinned them down about 50% using some odourless thinner, and then they were dabbed into all of the panel lines. The matte varnish meant that I had a lovely gradient when I was trying to blend in and get rid of any of the excess wash. That's what I'm doing here. I've got a clean brush just doused in some white spirit, allowing me to remove some of that excess wash and blend it in. The process was repeated on the upper surfaces of the aircraft, however this time I tried to concentrate a lot of that grime into areas where the crew would be getting on and off of the aircraft. Continuing, and to create some more grime around the aircraft, I'm going to be using an oil brusher. An oil brusher is pretty much a super quick drying oil paint, and I'm going to be using the Starship Filth colour. It is dabbed around areas where I want to do this grime build up, and then I'm going to be using a dry brush flat-headed brush if you want to be specific, and start to blend it in, and it gives me a great area of localized grime, and it just makes it look a little bit more dirty. I continued this effect around the entirety of the aircraft, upper surfaces and also lower surfaces, until I was happy with the grimy effect. Now to do the exhaust stains and other little streaks and stains, I'm going to be using my airbrush. What I've done here is I've mixed up a paint which uses about 60% Hull Red and 40% black, and it is thinned down 80%, so a super thin mixture giving me far more control. As well as this, I've lowered down my air pressure to about 8 psi, which gives me even more control over the paint. What I then need to do is I just need to trace out the basic shape of the exhaust stain which I want, and then all I do is spend a couple of minutes building up the opacity of that paint until I am happy with the result. This effect is also utilised in other areas of the aircraft. Here you can see I've also used them over the guns. I can now secure the exhaust stubs in place. These were painted using Mr. Colour's iron colour, and I also gave them a burnt umber wash to create that almost rusty effect. The landing gear assembly can now be cemented into place. I made sure that I also put the exhaust stains on the gear bay doors, and the entire sub-assembly was also tacked in place using super glue. The last little bit of weathering for this build is going to be using aluminium colour, and this is just to create some small chips around the aircraft, specifically on the leading edges. There are a couple of chips, and also around high access areas. To now give the aircraft its final finish, I'm going to be using VMS's matte varnish. I think this was better than satin. I just think the matte really makes it look even grubbier, which I was very happy with. The final parts of the assembly can now be put on. That includes the drop tanks, the propeller, and then the masking tape can be removed from the canopy, the rigging can be secured, and that is this build all finished. So thank you very much for watching. I really do hope that you've enjoyed. This model will be featured in Phoenix scale aviations in the near future, and I'll leave a link to them below. So without any further ado, enjoy the final photos and videos, and I'll see you next time guys. Bye bye.